A bright but troubled student gets involved with a local gang. Jason Carter was always considered a gifted student. With an exceptional mind for mathematics and a natural talent for problem solving, he had the potential to achieve great things. His teachers admired his intelligence, and some even believed he could earn a scholarship to a top university. However, brilliance alone wasn't enough to protect him from the harsh realities of his life. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, Jason had always been surrounded by crime, violence, and poverty. His father had abandoned the family when he was young, and his mother worked long hours at a diner, barely making enough to support them. Left to fend for himself most of the time, Jason struggled to resist the temptations of the streets. He tried to stay focused on school, but deep down, he felt a growing sense of frustration and loneliness. One day, while walking home from school, Jason was confronted by a group of older boys from a local gang. They had noticed his intelligence and offered him a way out of his financial struggles, easy money, protection, and a sense of belonging. At first he refused, knowing the dangers that came with gang life. But as his mother's debts piled up and the pressure of survival grew stronger, he found himself drawn toward the gang's influence. The gang leader, Rico, recognized Jason's potential and gave him small tasks that didn't involve violence, running errands, handling money, and even using his mathematical skills to manage their finances. At first, it felt harmless. Jason convinced himself that he wasn't really a criminal. He was just helping them organize their business. But the deeper he got, the harder it became to walk away. Over time, Jason's grades started slipping, and his teachers noticed his growing detachment. His best friend Marcus tried to warn him, "You don't belong with them, Jason. You're better than this." But Jason ignored him. The gang had given him something he never had before, a sense of respect and power. One night, everything changed. Rico asked Jason to drive a car to a specific location. It seemed simple enough, but when he arrived, he realized too late that he was delivering weapons. The police raided the area, and Jason barely escaped. Now he was in too deep. Rico made it clear, once you're in, there's no way out. As Jason wrestled with his choices, he realized he was at a crossroads. If he continued down this path, he would lose everything: his future, his freedom, and possibly his life. But leaving the gang wasn't as easy as he had thought. With law enforcement closing in and Rico growing suspicious of his hesitation, Jason had to make a decision: stay and become a criminal for life, or risk everything to break free. Would he find a way out, or had he already crossed the point of no return? Under pressure, he brings a gun to school and shoots his teacher. Michael Adams was once a bright but reserved student. Known for his intelligence and deep-thinking nature, he had the potential to excel academically. But beneath the surface, he was struggling. His life at home was filled with tension. His father was abusive, his mother was distant, and there was never a sense of peace. At school, things weren't any better. He was constantly bullied, mocked, and treated as an outcast. At first, Michael tried to endure it. He focused on his studies, hoping that one day he would escape the torment and build a better life. But the weight of his emotions kept growing. Every insult, every humiliation, and every push in the hallway made him feel smaller, weaker. No one seemed to notice his pain. No one cared. One day, he found himself drawn to a group of boys known for their dangerous lifestyle. They were part of a local gang, feared and respected. Unlike his classmates, they didn't mock him. Instead, they encouraged him to fight back. One of them, Jake, told him, "Respect isn't given, it's taken." That sentence echoed in Michael's mind for days. Jake handed him a gun, saying, "If you want them to stop treating you like a joke, you have to make them afraid of you." At first, Michael hesitated. He had never even touched a gun before. But something inside him had already snapped. He was tired of feeling powerless. The more he held the cold metal in his hands, the more he felt in control. Then came the day that changed everything. Michael's history teacher, Mr. Reynolds, called him out in front of the entire class for not submitting an assignment. The students laughed. It was the final straw. The rage that had been building inside him for years erupted. The next morning, Michael walked into school with the gun hidden under his jacket. His heart pounded, his hands trembled, but his mind was set. He wasn't going to be humiliated again. As soon as the lesson began, Mr. Reynolds asked Michael why he hadn't done his homework. The class turned to look at him, waiting for another moment of embarrassment. Instead, Michael stood up, pulled the gun from his jacket, and pointed it directly at the teacher. Gasps filled the room. Mr. Reynolds raised his hands, trying to calm him down, but Michael had already made his choice. He pulled the trigger. Chaos erupted. Students screamed and ducked for cover. Some ran out of the classroom in terror. Michael stood frozen, staring at his teacher, collapsing to the ground. Reality hit him like a shockwave. He had crossed a line he could never undo. Within minutes, the school was surrounded by police. Now, Michael had only two choices: surrender and face the consequences, or run and embrace the darkness that had consumed him. He escapes, but the police launch a massive manhunt. Michael Adams stood frozen as his history teacher, Mr. Reynolds, collapsed to the ground, blood pooling around him. The classroom was in chaos. Students screamed, desks crashed, and footsteps pounded in the hallways as people ran for their lives. His ears rang, his breath came in short gasps, and for a moment he couldn't move. But then it hit him. He had to run. Without thinking, he bolted out of the classroom, gripping the gun tightly in his shaking hands. The school hallways were a blur of terrified faces and panicked voices. Teachers tried to take control, but fear had turned everything into madness. The distant sound of police sirens made Michael's stomach twist. They were coming for him. He pushed through the emergency exit and sprinted toward the parking lot. His bike was locked up near the fence, but he didn't have time to fumble with the chain. Instead, he ran toward the woods behind the school, his only chance to disappear. His lungs burned as he pushed himself forward, branches scratching his arms and face. He had no plan, no destination, just the desperate need to escape. The manhunt begins. Minutes later, police swarmed the school. Officers stormed the classrooms, securing students and teachers, while paramedics rushed to Mr. Reynolds. Meanwhile, helicopters hovered above the city, and an alert went out. Armed and dangerous suspect on the run. Detective Sarah Collins was put in charge of the case. She had seen criminals run before, but something about this felt different. A bright student turning into a school shooter? She couldn't let him disappear. "Lock down the perimeter," she ordered. "We can't let him slip through." Roadblocks were set up across the city. Officers were stationed at bus terminals and train stations, and a search team with K-9 units was sent into the woods. Every available officer was hunting for Michael Adams. A desperate escape. Michael knew they were coming. He could hear the distant shouts of officers calling out his name. He had to keep moving. Every decision he made could be the difference between freedom and a lifetime in prison. As night fell, he found an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a broken door, but it was shelter. He collapsed inside, exhausted and terrified. His mind raced. Was Mr. Reynolds dead? Would they shoot him on sight? What would happen if they caught him? His phone buzzed. He hesitated, then looked at the screen. A message from his mother. "Michael, please, come home. The police just want to talk. Don't do this." Tears welled in his eyes. He wanted to believe her, but deep down, he knew the truth. There was no way back. He had fired the gun. He had become a fugitive, and now the entire city was hunting him down. The only question left was, how far was he willing to go to stay free? His descent into crime worsens as he commits more violent acts. Michael Adams had crossed the line. The moment he pulled the trigger on his teacher, his fate had changed forever. The world no longer saw him as a troubled student, but as a dangerous fugitive. And with the entire city hunting him, he had 2 choices: surrender or survive by any means necessary. He chose the latter. Hiding in the woods for days, hunger and fear gnawed at him. The abandoned cabin he had found offered temporary shelter, but without food or supplies, he knew he couldn't stay there for long. With helicopters scanning the area and search dogs closing in, he had to move. One night, driven by desperation, he sneaked into a small gas station outside town. His hood was up, his hands trembling inside his pockets. He just wanted some food, maybe some cash to keep moving. But when the cashier recognized him from the news and reached for the phone, Michael panicked. He pulled out his gun. "Don't!" he shouted, his voice shaky but firm. The old man behind the counter froze, his hands in the air. Michael didn't want to hurt anyone, but fear controlled him now. He grabbed cash from the register, stuffed some snacks into his backpack, and ran. His first armed robbery. No turning back. After escaping the gas station, Michael realized something. There was no way out of this. The police had now labeled him as more than just a school shooter. He was a fugitive, an armed robber, a growing threat. With each passing day, the guilt inside him started to fade, replaced by something darker. The more he ran, the more he felt like the world had forced him into this life. He convinced himself that he had no choice but to fight back. His crimes escalated. He stole a car at gunpoint from a terrified driver on a lonely highway. Later, when a police officer spotted him at a motel and tried to arrest him, Michael reacted with pure instinct. He fired. The officer survived, but now Michael was officially considered a violent criminal. News channels called him the teenage outlaw, and his face was plastered across every screen. A new identity. Michael knew he couldn't keep running forever, not without help. That's when he turned to the only people who could protect him, a local gang. They had heard about him, seen the news, and they liked what they saw. "You've got guts, kid," their leader Rico told him. "Stick with us, and no one will touch you." Michael hesitated, but deep down he knew he had nowhere else to go. By the time the police found his empty motel room days later, Michael Adams was no longer just a runaway. He was something much worse, a rising star in the city's criminal underworld. Showdown. He faces the consequences of his choices. Michael Adams had gone from a troubled student to one of the most wanted criminals in the city. His journey into darkness had been fueled by fear, desperation, and an unwillingness to surrender. Now, he was no longer just running. He was fighting to survive in a world that had already judged him guilty. For weeks, he had been hiding with a local gang, using their connections to evade capture. They gave him a new name, a place to stay, and a gun to keep by his side. He had committed crimes he never imagined himself capable of: armed robbery, carjackings, and even a shootout with the police. The Michael who once sat quietly in a classroom was gone, but deep inside, a part of him still wondered, was there any way out? One night, that question was answered for him. The final betrayal. The gang had promised to protect Michael, but in the world of crime, loyalty was just another lie. When the police put a massive bounty on his capture, his so-called brothers saw an opportunity. Rico, the gang leader who had once called him family, set him up. "They'll be here in an hour," Rico told the others, counting the cash he had received for betraying Michael. "Let them take the kid. We don't need this heat." Michael overheard everything. His heart pounded as he realized he had nowhere left to run. The showdown. The warehouse where he had been hiding was suddenly surrounded. Police sirens wailed in the distance, red and blue lights flashing through the broken windows. "Michael Adams!" a voice boomed through a megaphone. "There's no way out! Drop your weapon and surrender now!" Michael stood in the shadows, gripping his gun, sweat dripping down his face. His mind raced. He had spent so long running, fighting, trying to escape the inevitable. Now it had all led to this moment. He thought of his mother, who had begged him to turn himself in. He thought of Mr. Reynolds, the teacher he had shot in a moment of blind rage. He thought of the terrified faces at the gas station, the police officer he had wounded, the blood on his hands. This was it. His last decision. Gunfire erupted. The gang members, realizing they were trapped, opened fire on the police, and bullets tore through the warehouse. Michael ducked behind a stack of crates, his hands shaking. He could fight. He could die in a blaze of gunfire like the criminal they now believed he was. Or he could surrender. Slowly, Michael stepped out, dropping his gun to the ground and raising his hands. "I give up," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The officers rushed in, tackling him to the ground, handcuffing him as the weight of his choices finally crushed him. It was over. The tragic end of a boy who had once been full of promise, but had lost himself to the darkness.